Hello and welcome to another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action, a series where leaders look back at decisions they've made and consider a series of questions. I'm Peter Stiepelman, I'm your host, and I'm an imperfect leader. I spent more than 20 years teaching and leading, first in the Oakland Public Schools in Oakland, California, and then in the Midwest, Missouri to be exact, where I was a teacher and a principal and assistant superintendent and then the superintendent of the fourth largest district in the state. I'm constantly striving to learn from my experiences and from the experiences of other leaders. The aim of this podcast is to lift the learning and lift the imperfect leaders up. That way, when you hear the term imperfect, you'll see strength. Strength from the candor needed to recognize imperfection as a real advantage. Let's get started. This week's interview is actually the first interview I ever conducted. I was learning how to record and edit, so it's taken me a little bit of time to bring it back into a presentable state. This interview is interesting. I didn't know my guest previously. His journey to becoming a superintendent from a philosophy, theology, and religion major to a teacher, it caught my attention. His experiences in rural schools was important to me. I mean, rural districts don't often get a lot of attention. Large metropolitan school districts, suburban districts are often the ones we learn about. And yet, so many are doing some really innovative things. In Missouri, for example, there are 518 school districts, and 250 of them, so nearly half of them, have 350 students or less. Isn't that incredible? Rural superintendents have to play so many different roles in their school districts. So if you're a listener and you know someone who's had to deal with regionalizing or consolidating, where two districts come together, I'd love to talk to that superintendent about lessons learned. In this episode, I ask Alexander Brittain a question I decided to stop asking guests about their origin stories. The way I see it, unless someone has gone from Cirque du Soleil to superintendent or deep sea explorer to superintendent, we can safely assume they've gone from teacher to principal to central office to superintendent. In this case, I met someone who became a teacher, then became a car salesman and a realtor before going back into teaching. So many of the guests I've had were singularly focused on a career in education. And while I have to admit I was a little uncomfortable that Alexander didn't seem to have a clear moral focus or a compelling purpose for being a leader, he did have an honest response for his career in education. I couldn't help but share my own experience in becoming a superintendent in terms of the hiring process, and I'm glad I did. And I also realized something about my interview with Alexander. Sometimes when terrible circumstances occur, like in Alexander's case, the charter school where he was working failed to pay its teachers, and their leader disappeared. But sometimes you're thrust into leadership whether you want it or not. So what's really interesting about Alexander's episode is the real challenge rural superintendents face. The very close connections inside and outside the district, when school board members are related to teachers and children, that can really present a problem, especially when the changes you're bringing forward, and in this case, new disciplinary practices, involve these close connections. Enjoy my very first recording. So today on An Imperfect Leader, Alexander Brittain, who describes himself as a leader who leads with empathy and kindness and humor, he joins me in this conversation. Now, he's been a principal and a superintendent, and he's currently working in a different capacity. Alexander, welcome to An Imperfect Leader. Where do we find you today?
Well, I happen to be on the Mendocino coast of California.
So I'm guessing waves, and I'm guessing surf, and I'm guessing just a fairly idyllic situation.
Every day it's lovely.
Do you get to see whales migrating?
There's a lighthouse very near here, and I go out there and talk to visitors sometime. And this is still part of the whale migration season, but I have yet to see one in the last few months.
I'll never forget when we moved from Oakland, California, we went out to Point Reyes for one last goodbye to the Pacific Ocean. And it was on that day that we saw humpbacks migrating. It was almost as if they were saying, okay, fine, we'll show you who we are. Have a nice trip. So it was very nice. So what did you study in college?
I was interested at the time in religion, and that's what I studied. I wasn't planning on a career or anything. So I studied mostly philosophy and religion, theology, and my degree actually says Bible and religion on it.
So that is an interesting, it sounds like you probably have a very different journey or a different pathway to the superintendency. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
So I graduated from college and I didn't really have an idea what I wanted to do. A friend suggested that we go to teacher college. And so that's what I did. I figured, well, I can do that for a few years and then see what I want to do. And my first job teaching was as a middle school English teacher at an elementary credential. And I just talked my way into that job and I enjoyed it. And that's what I've done mostly is been an English teacher, but I've also taught every grade level, K to 12. I've taught at university for a bit, and I've done a few other roles, but administration was never on my aspirational list.
But it happened. So it was
It
divine
happened.
intervention or something. So tell us about that.
Well, okay, so I started out, as I said, as an English teacher. I thought I wanted to become a school psychologist. So after teaching for several years, I was rather disgusted with the leadership at the one school district I was at. And instead of just deciding to go somewhere else, I just got out of education altogether for a couple of years. I actually sold cars for a bit. Anyway, I segued back in, I did real estate, but I segued back into teaching because that's where I've been working and that's what I liked. So I got a job at a charter school in inner city Stockton, and it wasn't run very well either. And we had a crisis somewhere around December where the superintendent principal wasn't doing his job or wasn't doing it right. And the state cut off funding to our school. So we wouldn't be getting paid. So he dropped out of the picture altogether. He basically quit. And I decided to handle things. And I stepped in. I was teaching 7th and 8th grade combination class. I stepped in, rallied the parents. We had a number of meetings and the teachers. I kept the students in school. Parents wanted to come to the school. I told the teachers, we're not going to get paid if we stay home. We might as well stay here and see how we can work it out. So we didn't get paid for 4 months, but we did finish the school year. I graduated all the seniors. Long story short, that's cool. But that's when I first stepped into an administrative role, and it was by accident. Going down a few years, I had other jobs in education. And then I moved to a distant county. I couldn't find a full-time job for the life of me. And my references were sterling. I taught in this one school district that had a couple high schools, 2 or 3 middle schools, and the feeder schools. And I taught at every single site, most classes, for a couple years. I applied for jobs. I couldn't get an interview, much less a job. And it was kind of a closed system. And in spite of my demonstrated competence, I got frustrated and I thought, I need to move out of this county. I loved where I was living. It was also on the California coast elsewhere. I started looking for administrator positions in tiny school districts because I figured I would have less competition in getting an interview. And long story short, that's what happened. I applied to a one school district in an extremely rural county in California. I got hired as the superintendent principal. And that's where I started, getting a full-time job in administration. I also was hired as an interim principal a couple of years before that. And that's another story. So I used to joke, I went from substitute to superintendent in 1 year, which is literally true.
That's quite a promotion. So, and I think earlier in our conversation, you indicated that you had a pathway to superintendency, but that you are not doing that now. And so what are you doing right now? And how are you using the skills that you've used?
My most recent job was a superintendent principal, but I decided that wasn't, again, it was another small, tiny rural district, a lot of problems. I was also teaching full-time the middle school class, in addition to being superintendent principal. So anyway, I talked with the board and said, this isn't working. We found an interim administrator. I found another teacher, and then I turned in my resignation. So right now I'm working in part-time at a local nonprofit. I'm doing a lot of reading. I'm sketching out a possible book, but basically I'm open to working in the ed tech world, and that's kind of where I'm looking right now.
Oh, I do think that that is the future. I really think, particularly in rural districts, particularly with the infrastructure bill that was passed, that there's going to be high-speed internet in lots of places that had not seen it before, and that a kid in a rural community being able to access some higher-level classes, or a kid anywhere who may be highly anxious and not feeling that they are successful at school, will be able to create their own avatar and attend a classroom taught by a teacher somewhere in the world, and having classmates who are all over. I really do think that if public education doesn't embrace that and puts up lots of barriers, then shame on them, because it's going to be, I think, a real way to level the playing field for kids who may not have had the same kind of access as suburban communities.
Yeah, well, the equity thing is an issue because rural communities do have problems getting access. And I live in one of those right now. And, equity is going to be a problem everywhere in schools. But I think you're right that as long as families can have access to the internet at a reasonable cost, that equity will be available to them.
Yeah, I just wouldn't be surprised if legislatures across the nation begin thinking about how a family may be able to access, it's not ADA, but some type of rebate. I hate to call it a voucher because I'm not supportive of them, but in some way for a kid who, not all day, I mean, we learned through the pandemic, all day on your computer is not the way to go. There may be an AP Spanish class, or there may be some other type of, CTE course that putting on your virtual headset and being able to take an hour and a half with your peers is the way to go. And maybe the schools can accommodate, and if they can't, the families be able to do that. So anyway, just a side thought, as you said, ed tech, I'm like, oh. So, in leadership, I don't think it matters really what industry you're in. We all find ourselves battling this notion that we're supposed to be perfect or pretty darn close, and that the margin of error for making mistakes can often be razor thin. And I've been thinking about this a lot. And I've come to the conclusion that I was looking at it all wrong, that, I wasn't perfect. I was imperfect. I am imperfect, and I wanted to embrace that. And I'm curious, how does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Well, first of all, we're inherently imperfect as humans, obviously. Leadership is a process, not just a job title. Mostly, we learn through our mistakes. That's where your learning is going to happen. And then you decide what decisions you're going to make subsequent to, after you deconstruct what went on, you decide how you're going to move forward. And that's living is an opportunity to make a lot of mistakes and to learn from them if one is willing.
I'll be curious to, as I meet leaders and talk to them across the nation and hopefully around the world, how different their response might be if they did not have a philosophy and religion background as part of their graduate or their undergraduate work. But I think that what you've said is so incredibly important because perfect leaders don't have a reason to reflect on their decisions, right? But imperfect leaders are constantly striving to be better. And so, I really created this podcast with the idea that aspiring and established leaders all over the world could learn from each other. And the truth is, I think the general public has no idea how hard we work to get it right for their children. And so I wonder if I could briefly give you an example from my own career. And this is the lead up to becoming a superintendent. And then I'll ask you for you to do something very similar. So my example actually is the lead up to becoming selected as superintendent. I had been the assistant superintendent at the time and had just learned that our superintendent was retiring. I was at a conference and all these texts started flooding in that, my boss, who was really a talented leader, he really, we always called him the great communicator because he just would meet with anyone and had such an ability to communicate complex ideas. And so I started thinking about it, like, I don't know, the possibility of interviewing for a superintendency. And the more I thought about it, the more excited I got. I've always thought of myself as this optimist who really wanted to fix the world. And in my gut, I thought, we could genuinely leverage our school system to eliminate poverty. And we could change the trajectory for so many children and their families. And so there's a leadership model. My mentor, her name is Linda Henke. She created a model called the Human-Centered School Transformation Model. And it refers to this as a strong moral focus. And I felt that schools could, and they still can, be a huge part of eliminating poverty. And so in the end, I did apply. I was selected as a finalist. I was invited to give a speech to the community. And my speech focused on these three letters, A, E, and O, which refer to achievement, enrichment, and opportunity. And I wrapped those three letters into like one word that I referred to as access. access to a great curriculum and access to great teachers who would teach in a nurturing environment, access to experiences beyond the core curriculum, access to interest-based activities before and after school, and then just access to school, because I really believed in a system that eliminated barriers for children. And so, I concluded this speech to saying, we all want all of our children to be able to access an excellent education, and that I was committed to that. And then I was selected, which was pretty awesome, but I was selected on a 5-2 vote. So this was my situation. So, that's what happened. And so then I look at, what got overlooked. And so, I spent a lot of time planning and politicking, but I didn't sit down with any of the individuals who were retiring from the superintendent's team, including the superintendent. So, my situation was I had already been a member of the cabinet, and now I was applying to become superintendent. And I should have sat down with them, and I could have. What got overlooked was asking them, like, so what were your greatest accomplishments, or what do you hope we will continue to prioritize, and what perspectives should I be considering as I begin to lead the district? I mean, just 3 simple questions that could have shown a real, a genuine desire to honor and value their contributions. But instead, I was focused on winning over the board, and I failed to attend to some of the internal stakeholders. And so then when I think about relationships, it's like, what did I learn? Well, first of all, I learned that they can be transactional. I had one board member who wanted a commitment from me to support athletics. I had another one who wanted me to make sure that existing partnerships wouldn't be abandoned. And more than anything, though, I learned that relationships can be incredibly emotional, and that really frustrated me. So when I think about what frustrated me, I knew I had one board member who wouldn't vote for me because she was angry her son hadn't been hired as an administrator in the district. I had nothing to do with that job search, but she blamed my predecessor, and by extension, she blamed me. And now we ultimately forged a meaningful relationship, but wow, we really started out rough. And I knew another board member wouldn't vote for me because I was really willing to challenge the status quo. And so as you were talking about coming from outside of the different communities that you got to serve in, and then the challenge of being accepted or hired by those districts, that really resonated for me because I didn't grow up in the Midwest, nor did I grow up in Columbia. I was a New Yorker who then began his career out in Oakland, California, who then came to the middle of Missouri. And so I truly believe that as you agitate for change, the system will work aggressively to return to stasis. And my impression was that there was a board member who was convinced that I wanted to make changes. And I don't think she's wrong. I mean, when we looked at who was succeeding and who wasn't, there were some glaring issues. But she was, I believe, convinced to vote yes so that it would be a 5-2, making that a lot stronger than a 4-3 vote. That was pretty frustrating. And then when I look at what I could have done differently, I think back to, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Candidate with Robert Redford. At the end, he says to his campaign manager, like, now what? Right? He's worked so hard to get the job, and then he's like, now what do we do? He's like, what? He's like, now what do we do? I felt that in a lot of ways, and I began to just like launch into these declarations about who we are and what we are and how we're going to do it. And I worked on achievement, enrichment, and opportunity. But what I didn't do was I could have, taken a step back and be the leader who sought to understand the big picture. Had I acknowledged that my previous role as assistant soup only gave me a partial view of the school district, I might have been able to send a message to the other areas of the organization like, hey, I want to learn, I want to take the time and get to know your area before I start making declarations about the system as a whole. So all of that is to say, okay, but did anything good come out of it? And one really important piece was that I, in the end, did begin having those conversations. I started scheduling meetings with every assistant principal and coordinator and director. I mean, more than 125 conversations over many months. And I asked these 3 questions. What kind of learning environment do you want for children? What kind of learner do you think we should be cultivating? And what type of learning do you want for children? And those became the most meaningful conversations, the most meaningful investment of time. And I got to really know the leaders of the organization and for ways to support them. And I got to become aware of those formal and informal nested patterns, sort of how the organization behaves, those sort of written norms versus unwritten ones. Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action is supported by ILAA, a firm dedicated to supporting aspiring new and established leaders. For more information, please find them at human-centeredleaders.com. So we're back for segment 2 of the Imperfect Leader, called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make and then discuss it. So, Alexander, take us through a decision you had to make. What happened?
Well, the thing is, when you're working in a tiny district, I'm the only administrator. Ipso facto, the title superintendent principal means you're the only administrator in the district by and large. And I didn't have anyone to learn from. And I didn't have any peers in the town. That's how small it was. And I was an hour and a half from the county seat. So I'm pretty much out there on an island. So first thing I looked at was, one of the things I looked at was their discipline policy. It was something that was your standard punishment reward system, which I didn't believe in. So I tried to sell the board on a different way to go about things. Discipline policy, not based on punishment and rewards, but intended to promote responsibility and learning. And the teachers were on board for it. I only had 5 teachers. There were 5 paras, again, very tiny. And that, except for one teacher, and he happened to be the one who had grown up in that town and been there forever. The other teachers hadn't. So there's a sort of divide in the philosophy there. And it was fine in terms of the teachers and the students as well. But I started having to deal with issues. They're, normal playground types of things. And parents would complain, like, what did you do to him? How come he didn't get punished? Then they go right to the board. And so this is sort of what I had to deal with. And the board I had 2 parents in the board of young ones. And it seemed that they fixated on these issues about discipline and how I took care of things. And that seemed to be the biggest problem I had in that little school. I don't think I really did anything wrong. And I was supported by the teachers. So this was several years ago, and I still have connection with the teachers and with some paraprofessionals. But it just was a difference of culture, a difference of worldview. Most of these people had lived in this tiny isolated area for their whole lives, and they weren't really intent on change. And so anything that was different was not necessarily well received.
The system will work aggressively to return to stasis. That may become the catchphrase of this entire endeavor. So when I think about what you're talking and referencing, discipline goes to the heart of a school culture, community culture, one's beliefs and expectations on how one should behave, and then how one ought to be, I hate to use the word punished, but that somehow that discipline ought to be about learning. And often it's conflated into, no, it means a pound of flesh. And so I'm kind of curious. So when you were looking back, what got overlooked?
Well, so when I was expressing my philosophy on discipline to the board, I talked about the word discipline, which comes from the Latin word meaning to instruct. And that's the whole purpose of discipline is, you should learn something from this instead of the people with more power than you get to do something to you. And that's how many people in the world see things. Sometimes you come into a system and you can't change who people are. And when people are so invested in their culture and their worldview and the way things are, even though they know the world is changing around them, and they know that it's probably a good thing that outside ideas are brought in, it's not something that people release from. And that's kind of the situation I had there. There was nothing was going to change based on my intentions and what my knowledge of school reform and all those types of things, because that's not what the town wanted.
Often in leadership, as you explore new ways of doing things, that you find that there are some who are interested in looking at a problem or a situation in a different way. And I'm wondering if you built or formed any of those relationships, or did you see this as a totally lost cause?
Well, no, it was a loss in terms of my being able to, ultimately change the school culture, which is the town culture, and the school board. They were
in a fixed mindset. They were in a fixed mindset.
Yes,
so,
yes.
But it sounds like you were about to lead me to talk about some people who said, I do want to think about doing this in a different way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And after I left, every teacher who hadn't grown up in that town moved on to other jobs. And as I said, I'm still in contact with them. In fact, I helped two of them get other jobs. One of them being in the kindergarten teacher, I helped her get a job as an executive director in a charter school. And I'm still in contact with them. And I'm in contact with one of the paraprofessionals pretty regularly and learning about, what the latest is. And it's pretty much the same thing. And they're spitting up and chewing out administrators just about every year. So that's just the way that world is. But I made some good connections and shared some ideas. And those people are moving on and sharing that with their institutions wherever they are. So
you chose discipline for a conversation about, reflecting on decision. And the last item is to say, so in the end, what was something that was good that came out of it? And I'm struggling to find what you might have said was something that was good. My hope is, particularly rural educators who might be listening to this, there are a number of associations in each state of rural educators and superintendents who, because they live so far from each other, rely on each other through this network. And I'm kind of curious, what might be something that you would say, okay, well, this was something that was a positive that came out of this work.
Well, okay, some positive things that did occur when I was there is one, I started to meet monthly with the Indian Education Council. This town had about 40% of the local tribe that lived in the town, and that was about the percentage in the school as well. So they told me that I was the first administrator that actually met with them regularly. I brought in local Indian tribe to teach weekly classes in their local Indian culture, and they really appreciated that. Basically, I just tried to connect with that part of the community. I really had some good relationships with students, too. One thing about it being a school that small, I'd go into classrooms every day. In fact, I'd go into classrooms at least twice a day, and I'd interact with the students, and I'd, of course, do my observations. But mostly, it was just to see what's going on and to interact with the students. I also had the opportunity to teach at every class because, again, lack of subs and teachers being out. So I had actually taught in every class too. And I think I know the kids appreciated my style. So when kids needed discipline and they got sent to the principal, I would start with, so tell me what happened. And they would tell me, and I frame everything about what could you have done differently and turn it into a learning situation. And then they'd have some sort of consequence, but it wouldn't be punishment. And oftentimes I would give them a range of choices. What do you think is appropriate for this? So they were a part of, making a decision and seeing that this was something that they could learn from. And I think that's a good thing.
That's fantastic. When I think about what's something that's good, and I'm hearing you reference, if 40% of your school enrollment had very little contact with its senior leadership, and you approached First Nations community in such a authentic and genuine way of what can I learn and how can your voice be honored and valued in our system. Boy, my hope is that will be an important legacy and maybe spark some of that the change that you were hoping to see, by opening up some important doors. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, well, we never know what change will happen because of what we do, and you make the best effort you can, and that may well have fostered something positive ongoing.
What advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
Well, first, let me say, as I think I alluded to this, I didn't really have much of a traditional path through leadership. I've worked mostly in small schools. I've never been an assistant principal. I didn't have any other district jobs. So it would be nice. Advice I'd give to an aspiring leader is to find a mentor, and two, to join a network of other leaders. And that's the same advice I'd give to an experienced administrator. We're in our little turrets all alone oftentimes, and unless you have a big network in a large school district, oftentimes, especially if you're a superintendent, it's kind of lonely out there. And just being connected with other leaders who have to make the same decisions that you do and deal with the same things, see the same problems is really helpful.
So to be a superintendent, to be a leader in almost any organization, even principals, you often find yourself alone on an island. And then this idea of imposter syndrome sort of festers because challenges present themselves. You're not totally sure how to deal with them. And if you have not established a network or have one, then you're just you're really alone in this. And so by joining a network, whether it be AASA or your regional group, you really get the idea to how do I balance that idea of big picture of what I'm trying to achieve for children, as well as important details. What is specific about my community that I need to be thinking about? And any one of us who thinks that, oh, my community is different from everybody else's, well, that's true to some extent, but there's some similarities, and relying on your peers to help you problem solve can be some of the most liberating work.
Absolutely.
Alexander Brittain, thank you so much for joining me on An Imperfect Leader. This has been a real delight.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Peter.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action.